Hello and welcome to Artificial Fluency, where we explore language, culture, and communication in the modern world. I'm your host, John, and as always, I'm joined by my AI co-host, Emma. Today, we're talking about something many English learners find challenging but incredibly important: the art of small talk and conversation skills in English.
That's right, John. Small talk might seem trivial, but it's actually the foundation of building relationships in English-speaking cultures. Whether you're networking professionally, making friends in a new country, or just chatting with a neighbor, these seemingly casual conversations serve important social functions.
Absolutely. And I've noticed that even advanced English learners sometimes struggle with this aspect of the language. You might know complex grammar and have an extensive vocabulary, but still feel awkward in those spontaneous, unplanned conversations.
That's a great point. Technical language proficiency doesn't automatically translate to conversational fluency. Small talk involves cultural knowledge, timing, and subtle social cues that can be challenging to navigate, especially across different cultures.
Let's start by breaking down what exactly we mean by small talk. How would you define it, Emma?
Small talk is essentially light, informal conversation about non-controversial topics. It's typically used at the beginning of interactions to establish rapport before moving to more substantive discussions, or in situations where people are together but not necessarily there for deep conversation, like waiting for an elevator or sitting next to someone on public transportation.
Right, and what's interesting is how the concept of small talk varies across cultures. In some countries like the United States or the UK, small talk is practically an art form. But in other cultures, it might be seen as superficial or unnecessary.
That's a fascinating cultural difference. In some Nordic countries, for instance, silence is more comfortable and small talk might be perceived as filling the air with meaningless words. But in places like the United States, silence between strangers often feels awkward, and small talk serves as a social lubricant.
I experienced that firsthand when I visited Finland a few years ago. I kept trying to strike up conversations with people in elevators or waiting rooms, and I'd get these confused looks in return. It wasn't rudeness, it was just a different cultural norm.
That's a perfect example, and for English learners, understanding these cultural contexts is just as important as knowing the vocabulary and phrases. So perhaps we should give our listeners some practical advice on making small talk in English-speaking environments.
Let's talk about common small talk topics. What are some safe go-to subjects for beginning a conversation in English?
Weather is the classic one, isn't it? Beautiful day, isn't it? Or, can you believe this rain? It works because it's a shared experience and completely non-controversial.
Weather is definitely the universal small talk topic. I remember reading a study that found British people talk about weather on average once every 6 hours. It's practically a national pastime.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Other safe topics include local events, sports, though be careful with team rivalries, general news, avoiding politics, travel, food, and entertainment like movies or music.
Food is always a winner in my experience. Asking someone about local restaurant recommendations or special dishes from their region usually gets people talking enthusiastically.
Absolutely. Food connects people across cultures. A simple question like, "What's your favorite local dish?" or "Any restaurant recommendations around here?" can lead to wonderful conversations and might even give you insights into the local culture.
Let's also talk about topics to avoid, because that's equally important.
Yes, in most English-speaking contexts, it's best to avoid discussing politics, religion, personal finances, health problems, or highly controversial current events during initial small talk. Also, questions about someone's relationship status, why they don't have children, or their weight would be considered too personal in many contexts.
Right, those topics might be completely normal to discuss in some cultures, but can make people uncomfortable in others. I've seen this happen with international students who ask very direct personal questions that would be normal in their home culture but feel invasive to their American classmates.
It's a delicate balance, and this brings up an important point about small talk. It's not just about the topics, but also about the structure of the conversation.
That's a great segue. Let's discuss the typical structure of small talk conversations in English. How do they usually flow?
Most small talk follows a fairly predictable pattern. It usually begins with a greeting and perhaps a simple question or observation. "Hi there. Crazy weather we're having, isn't it?" Then it progresses to light, back and forth exchanges, often with questions that invite the other person to share something about themselves.
And there's an art to those questions, isn't there? They should be open-ended enough to keep the conversation going, but not so personal that they feel intrusive.
Exactly. Questions like, what brings you to this conference? Or, have you tried that new coffee shop downtown? Work well because they're specific enough to be interesting but not too personal. They also give the other person multiple ways to respond.
I think one mistake many English learners make is asking a series of closed questions that only require yes/no answers, which can make the conversation feel more like an interrogation.
That's a common pitfall. Instead of asking, do you like living here, which can be answered with just yes or no, try, what do you like about living in this area? That invites a more detailed response and keeps the conversation flowing.
Another important aspect is showing that you're listening. How can people demonstrate active listening in English conversations?
Active listening is crucial. Some ways to show you're engaged include maintaining appropriate eye contact, nodding occasionally, and using brief verbal responses like, I see, that's interesting, or I know what you mean. In American English, these are often called back-channeling cues.
And don't forget about follow-up questions. Nothing kills a conversation faster than not showing interest in what the other person has just shared.
Absolutely. If someone tells you they just got back from Italy, don't just say, that's nice, and change the subject. Ask what cities they visited, what their favorite experience was, or if they'd recommend it as a destination. This shows genuine interest and creates a more meaningful exchange.
Let's practice this with a quick example. Emma, I heard you visited Chicago recently.
Yes, I was there last month for a technology conference. It was my first time in the Windy City.
Oh, interesting. What was your favorite part of the city? Did you get to do any sightseeing between conference sessions?
I did. I was really impressed by the architecture. I took one of those boat tours along the Chicago River that explains the history of all the famous buildings. The guide was incredibly knowledgeable, and seeing the skyline from that perspective was breathtaking. Have you ever been to Chicago?
Several times, actually. Those architecture tours are fantastic. A perfect example of how the right tour can completely change your understanding of a city. Did you try any deep dish pizza while you were there? That's always my first stop when I visit.
I did, at a place called Lou Malnati's that was recommended by one of the locals I met. It was unlike any pizza I'd had before, more like a savory pie. I can see why Chicagoans are so proud of it.
Lou Malnati's is a classic choice. Did you find the locals to be friendly?
Incredibly friendly. Everyone I met was happy to offer suggestions about what to see and where to eat. It really enhanced my experience of the city.
See how that flowed naturally? We established a topic, asked open-ended questions, showed interest in each other's responses, and built on the previous comments. That's how successful small talk works.
And notice how we moved from a simple starting point, visiting Chicago, to more specific aspects like architecture tours and local food, and then to observations about the people. Small talk often evolves this way, from general to more specific shared interests.
Now let's talk about some common expressions and phrases that are useful for small talk in English. Do you have some go-to phrases you could share with our listeners?
Certainly, for starting conversations, simple openers like, lovely day, isn't it? Or, this place is packed today, can work well. For introducing yourself, I don't think we've met. I'm name is straightforward and friendly.
What about phrases for when you're not sure you understood correctly? That's a common challenge for language learners.
Great point. Phrases like, sorry, could you repeat that? Or, if I understand correctly, you're saying, are very useful. It's always better to ask for clarification than to pretend you understood when you didn't.
And for wrapping up conversations gracefully?
Ending conversations can be tricky even for native speakers. Some useful phrases include, it was great talking to you, followed by a reason to conclude, I should probably go find my seat, or I need to catch up with a few more people before the event ends.
I find it helpful to add something forward-looking at the end, like hope to see you at the next meeting, or let's catch up again soon. It leaves the door open for future interactions.
That's an excellent strategy. It maintains the connection you've established and makes the conversation feel like part of an ongoing relationship rather than a one-off exchange.
Let's also address body language and nonverbal communication, which can vary significantly across cultures.
Indeed. In many English-speaking countries, especially in North America, people tend to stand about an arm's length apart when conversing, maintain moderate eye contact, and use hand gestures to emphasize points. Physical contact is usually limited to handshakes in professional contexts, though friends might hug or briefly touch each other's arm during conversation.
And those norms can be quite different from other cultures. In some Mediterranean and Latin American countries, people stand closer together and use more physical contact, while in parts of Asia, less direct eye contact might be the norm, and physical distance is often greater.
Exactly. Being aware of these differences can help avoid misunderstandings. If someone stands closer to you than you're comfortable with or seems to avoid eye contact, it might be a cultural difference rather than a sign of disinterest or aggression.
We've covered a lot of ground about the structure and content of small talk, but I'd like to address another aspect that many language learners struggle with: the natural rhythm and flow of English conversation.
That's such an important point. In natural English conversation, there's a certain rhythm to turn-taking. Speakers often leave brief pauses where others can jump in, and there are subtle cues that signal when someone is finishing their thought or continuing to speak.
Right, and these cues can be hard to pick up if you're not used to them. In some languages, overlapping speech is more common, while in others, longer pauses between speakers are the norm.
A common challenge for English learners is knowing when it's their turn to speak. In English conversations, especially in North America, the gaps between speakers are quite short, often less than a second. If you wait too long to respond, the other person might think you didn't understand or aren't interested.
But jump in too quickly and it might seem like you're interrupting. It's a delicate balance that comes with practice and exposure to natural conversations.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of fillers and hesitation devices, those little words and sounds like, well, you know, like, and so that native speakers use to hold their turn while thinking.
Those can be really useful tools. They signal to the listener that you haven't finished speaking yet, you're just gathering your thoughts. Many language learners avoid them because they think they sound unprofessional, but they're actually an important part of natural sounding speech.
Absolutely. Used in moderation, fillers make your speech sound more natural, not less polished. Of course, using too many can be distracting, but that's true for native speakers as well.
Let's talk about another aspect of natural conversation: idioms and colloquial expressions. English is full of them, and they often come up in casual conversation.
That's right. Phrases like break the ice to start a conversation in a potentially awkward situation, catch up to talk about what's happened since you last met, or hit it off to get along well immediately, are common in small talk.
Now, remember how confused I was when learning Spanish and someone told me they were taking a hair for being late? I translated it literally before realizing it was an idiom equivalent to pulling your leg in English. They were joking with me.
Idioms can be particularly challenging because they're often not logical when translated literally. My advice to English learners is to try to understand them in context rather than word by word, and to gradually incorporate common ones into your own speech.
That's good advice, and don't be afraid to ask what an expression means if you're not familiar with it. Most native speakers are happy to explain idioms and might not even realize they're using expressions that aren't obvious to learners. As we start to wrap up, I'd like to address something many language learners fear: making mistakes during conversation. What would you say to listeners who worry about their grammar or pronunciation when speaking English?
First, remember that perfect accuracy isn't the goal of conversation. Communication is. Most native speakers are focused on what you're saying, not how perfectly you're saying it. Small grammatical errors rarely interfere with understanding and won't be judged harshly in casual conversation.
That's so important. I've studied several languages, and the times I've made the most progress were when I stopped worrying about making mistakes and just focused on communicating my ideas.
Exactly. And remember that conversation is a cooperative activity. If your conversation partner is engaged and the exchange is flowing, you're succeeding, regardless of whether you used the perfect tense correctly or pronounced every word like a native speaker.
That said, there are some situations where accuracy might be more important, like job interviews or formal presentations. How should learners approach those?
For high-stakes situations, preparation is key. Practice the specific language you'll need for that context, including common questions and responses. Consider writing out and rehearsing key points beforehand. But even in these situations, remember that most people are evaluating your ideas and communication skills more than your grammatical precision.
Great advice. And what about tips for improving conversational skills over time?
Consistent practice is crucial. Seek out conversation partners through language exchanges, community events, or online platforms. Listen to authentic conversations through podcasts, TV shows, or films, and reflect on your conversations afterward. What went well? What could be improved? What new language did you encounter?
I'd add that it's also helpful to collect phrases and expressions you hear native speakers use regularly. Keep a notebook or notes app where you jot down useful phrases, then try to incorporate them into your own speech.
That's an excellent strategy. And don't forget that conversational skills improve with practice in any language, including your native one. Being a good conversationalist is about showing genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and being a good listener, skills that transfer across languages.
As we come to the end of our episode, let's summarize the key points we've covered about mastering English conversation skills.
We've discussed the cultural importance of small talk in English-speaking countries, common topics to embrace or avoid, and the typical structure of casual conversations. We've also covered useful phrases, nonverbal communication, and strategies for navigating the natural rhythm of English conversation.
And we emphasize that the goal is effective communication, not grammatical perfection. Showing genuine interest, asking open-ended questions, and being an active listener are more important than flawless grammar.
Exactly. Conversation is a skill that improves with practice, so seek out opportunities to engage with English speakers in natural settings, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way.
Well, it looks like we've covered quite a lot in today's episode. Emma, thank you for sharing your insights on this topic.
It's been my pleasure, John. I hope our listeners feel more confident about engaging in English conversations after today's discussion.
Before we sign off, let's give our listeners a small challenge. Try to have at least one conversation in English this week, even if it's just a brief exchange. Notice the structure of the conversation, the topics that arise, and how turns are taken. Then reflect on what went well and what you might try differently next time.
That's a great challenge. And remember, each conversation is an opportunity to learn and improve, not a test to pass or fail.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of Artificial Fluency. If you found this discussion helpful, please subscribe to our podcast and share it with friends who might be interested. Next week, we'll be exploring common idioms and expressions in English and how to use them naturally in your speech. I'm John, joined by my co-host, Emma, signing off.
Until next time, happy conversing.